Hi, welcome to Carnegie, which is a funny thing for me to say because I am a Brookings person, not a Carnegie person, but I walk next door to welcome you here. My name is Benjamin Wittes, and this is all you're going to hear from me because I'm just here to introduce our two actual speakers. But it's a great pleasure to do that because this is a book that I think is actually an enormously important contribution. And I have, for a lot of reasons that you're going to hear today, it's actually a really serious effort at telling us all to slow down in the way we think about information systems and the way we think about managing information and information attacks on our beings and societies. Alicia Wanless has been working on this book in one form or another for a really long time. It grows out of work that she did for her dissertation. It grows out of a lot of deep thinking that she's been doing over a long period of time. And it's a real pleasure to be here for its introduction to this community and to the US policy community more generally. So, who is Alicia Wanless? Alicia Wanless is the director of the Information Environment Project here at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, where she is also a senior fellow with the Technology International Affairs Program, Technology and International Affairs Program. She is also a dear personal friend and the co-host of a show that we do almost daily, called Dog Shirt TV, hence the dog shirt. And in a world in which people are unusually glib about this subject, she is remarkably unglib and serious and willing to be slow as a result. And I say that in praise, not in criticism. One of the big messages of this book is slow down and don't be so arrogant as to think you understand the system well enough to regulate it at any given time. And I met Alicia at a conference when she was working on this subject as her dissertation. And this was right in the heart of the period right after the Russian interference in the US elections in 2016. And everybody around the room was talking about how we have to do something. And Alicia was very ready to be the skunk at the garden party. We were all going around. And she gave this very brief little talk about how we actually don't know what we're talking about. And we talk about information environments as though we know what they are, and we don't. And she gave a list of things that we don't know in relation to international information environments. And the entire room listened to her politely, and then went on with the conversation as though she had not said a word of it. And that would have been the end of it, except that two things happened, which was one, that I realized that I was in the presence of a very formidable mind. And the second thing was that every single one of the people in that room started saying those same things without crediting her over the next 2 years. These became things that people just said. And that's what this book is. It's all the things that we are uncomfortable to admit about this project that we have of managing information in complex democratic and non-democratic societies. So that is all I'm going to say in introduction of Alicia, except there's one other thing which I will come back to at the end. her interlocutor for this conversation will not be me. I'm going to shut up in a minute. It will be Vera Bergengruen, who is a national security reporter at the Wall Street Journal. She's based out of here in DC. She was previously a senior correspondent for Time magazine, where she covered the intersection of national security, tech, politics, and reported cover stories from Ukraine, Argentina, and El Salvador. She has a long career prior to that, including for BuzzFeed News. And pivotally for this conversation, she attended the Humboldt Schule in Mexico City, which is named for perhaps the hero of Alicia's book, Alexander von Humboldt, about whom I'm sure we will hear today. With that, I'm going to turn it over to them.
Well, welcome. Thank you so much. I think, looking at this book, and this was a great introduction for it, because as we spoke about Humboldt, who obviously categorized the natural world, just to start, I'd be really interested, your book is called The Information Animal, and the underlying basis of it is that, information ecology should be studied similar to real ecology, and that it should be categorized and understood as, with the same seriousness and categorization in order to understand where everything comes from and how to have a language to speak about it. So it's a pretty big undertaking. It's like single-handedly taking on, the natural world. So how did you first kind of come upon this idea and decide to embark on this book?
So information ecology, which I would say is the study of the information environment and ecosystems within it, really came about a couple of ways. One was that I had actually really been researching things like propaganda and how it was changing in a digital age, and my background was in Russian. And I had been unfortunate in graduating at a time when nobody cared about Russia, so the jobs I could find would be in things like Stratcom. So I actually had experience running campaigns. And one of the things that kept standing out to me was that we were getting pitched all of these tools and services, and everybody could promise you that they were going to change hearts and minds, but there wasn't a lot of evidence for the efficacy of what was being pitched. And then I started digging more into research to try to understand that. And I really wasn't finding satisfying answers to understand whether propaganda did work or not. And that led me to kind of start to look at the space around. And at that time, the military was the only place talking about that, and they had some definitions, which were also kind of unsatisfying because they didn't explain how the information environment worked. And I cannot remember who told me this. It was a passing conversation, and they said how we use these words like information environment, we use ecosystem, but we don't have ecology. We do not have the equivalent of a field of study. And long-winded way of saying, I got encouraged by several people, including my supervisor at King's College London and Herb Lynn at Stanford, to pursue focusing more on the information environment and really lean into it.
Yeah. And you kind of describe this current moment as a competition for reality. And your book is great because it goes into a long historical view as well. As obviously this has existed forever. Information is as old as humans, and how we process it and categorize it is that old as well. But when it comes to this competition for reality, which has only sped up in our current moment, can you tell us what that means and I guess in practice?
Right. And then this also kind of comes back from a lot of different terms that were being used and floated around, like information warfare is one that's commonly used, but it seems to take the whole idea of how people are engaging for a kind of competition for ideas all the way to like open conflict and war really quickly. And I think there's lots of things that happen in between. But the essence of it is that information competition is when you get two or more communities competing for their version of reality to be adopted by the whole. And this escalates when the two communities have worldviews that are incompatible with each other. And then they add more and more information for their side. They use all of the available means, tools, technology that they can to get their idea out there, and they flood the information environment, and often it comes along with different forms of information pollution.
Yeah. And you've described this as that all of us are basically just stuck in the middle. We're kind of caught in the middle to an extent of this competition for reality and competing narratives that are trying to like take us one way or the other. In terms, as someone who has studied this so deeply and has basically created this, this, I'm not sure it's a roadmap, but a tool for us to understand what we're looking at. Can you tell us a little bit more about, about how someone, if any of us read this book, how to understand, how we can find, kind of take charge of that, how we can understand our own environment?
Right. I think in large part that is kind of a central theme of the book, trying to provide some sort of framing for people to to understand what they're living in. Like, what is an information ecosystem? How are we a part of it? And how does it affect us? I mean, one of the things that happened while I was working on the thesis was that I'm Canadian, and everybody knows that because I'm always bringing it up. There was a freedom rally that was happening at the time of COVID in Ottawa, and this was just really apparent that worldviews had diverged, and they just really weren't the same. Like, one group was adamant that vaccines shouldn't be enforced and they didn't work and they didn't want any of these restrictions, and then you had like other communities who were really behind it and they were just dueling it out. But at the same time, it was also in this context of a wider global struggle right now that seems to be ongoing between different worldviews around where democracy should go, for example. And I was pretty upset in watching this, because it feels like that's exactly the time that we're living in. All of the case studies that I had looked at from the book, that period just before a war breaks out, where you have two communities who just can't agree and everybody else is being swept up in it and being pushed to take sides.
Yeah. And one of the things that's obviously the most important in this book is, again, giving us I think part of what your hope is, or what you're trying to do, is give us a common language and terminology. So when we discuss this, it's not just you believe this, I believe that, or this information, is true and this isn't, or, we all can just live in our parallel bubbles, but that there is a common language. So when there is information out there, when there is especially a crisis point, we can all kind of refer to the same, to the same objective set of facts to an extent, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think in large part it was also to try to explain a way for researchers to situate their different pieces of research to get to a bigger understanding. And this is where like Humboldt is an inspiration, because not only did he articulate the first Western viewpoint of ecosystems and how they function and how different elements work together, and that they are similar around the world and can be categorized and put forward ways of measuring it. He also went further with Cosmos to try to present an understanding of the whole world. And to do that, he corresponded with hundreds of researchers who were many in emerging fields to string it together. And I think this is not the answer of all things. It's a beginning point that hopefully collectively we can go and build this field. But yes, very much so, there's this element of let's say the same things. We see these terms like information environment and ecosystem being used interchangeably. People, depending on what they're researching, mean different things. If you're studying media, it might just be the news. If you're studying information science, it might be the library system, a university, an information communication system. If you're studying social media, it's that. And so we're talking across each other and not really getting ahead.
Yeah, and so I think the way I first met you actually was obviously as an expert source for my articles. I was reporting a ton at the time, post-2016, on, again, the information environment, because words like disinformation, misinformation were still first becoming kind of a commonplace shorthand for a variety of things, and no one had the same definition. And I remember at the time, even large outlets were hiring disinformation reporters, and these weren't fact checkers. They were just supposed to cover. And I interviewed for several of those jobs, I remember, and found it such a strange beat, because it was, the people who do it are excellent reporters, but disinformation isn't necessarily its own category. It refers to everything. So what I noticed from reading through the book was, again, how you were trying to make sure that we were careful about the terminology that we use. And one of the, going back to the ecological parallels, one of the things you use is pollution, right? Information pollution, that's a good way to understand it. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
So I went for a broader category of a concept, in part because there's many ways in which an environment can be polluted, and some of it's deliberate and some of it isn't. And I think maybe my thinking also stemmed from a real dislike for disinformation and the whole debate that has been raging for 10 years about meanings in it. And I don't want to rehash this, but now I'm here. Like misinformation is false or misleading information. Disinformation is that, but spread deliberately, and then you get further ones on. And I think that we get mired then in like, well, was it on purpose? Is it not? But then there's like all of these other ways in which the information environment is also degraded. So I think back to the English Civil War and the pamphlets that were being printed. Yeah, you had a competition between views about, you know, how the church should be at the time and how far it should go into Protestant Reformation, et cetera. But you also just had like low quality content of deformed, like stories about deformations and horror stories and things that were just entertainment that aren't great quality. And we have that too, right? We've got spam and all other sorts of attacks. And then you have things of just maybe poor opinion or infotainment. And so to try to capture the breadth of stuff that happens.
Right. And I actually think that's a really good, again, as someone who on the reporting side has done this a lot, find it a very useful way to try to speak about it, because otherwise, I mean, the whole term disinformation has obviously also become politicized, and now kind of people just decided that that's not really something that you know, I don't know, there was like the previous administration tried to really devote a lot of resources to it, and then it seemed like it was politicized, and now the word has just kind of, I think, become toxic to the whole debate. So I think giving like a more neutral language that is almost an academic, scientific language we can use really eliminates that idea that, you know, there is no one who can really determine, you know, can really categorize information that way.
Right, and I think that's also one of the reasons why we have to step back and understand the system, right? If we just focus on specific threats at a specific time, we never really get ahead. We'll always be just moving from threat to threat or new technology to new technology, and I think that that's put us on a back footing for how we address stuff. And I think there's also other issues, like disinformation, by the time it's present in an information ecosystem, is already an idea. It's already something that has been expressed and likely adopted by a group, and then now you're talking changing minds. And that's where I think there's a slippery slope in terms of policy and how it's perceived by people who may be the ones that are targeted to have their minds changed.
Right. And, you know, one of the reasons I really recommend, you know, this historic view you take, because we kind of think of it as something that originated with the internet or with technology, but obviously, you know, just the idea of how information is processed and spread and competing narratives is as old as we said, as old as humanity. You have really great examples in here, but kind of taking the current view, you were writing this book at a time when obviously generative AI was really starting to take off. It is just, in my opinion, you have taken a longer view, really speeding up the pace, obviously, at which a lot of this is happening. So I'm curious how you were thinking about this as you were doing your thesis, as you were researching this and trying to wrap your mind around it and give us a framework. You know, it kind of felt like it was speeding away at the same time.
I mean, I think that everybody who goes through a technological shift in terms of how we process and share information feels to a degree that there is like a speeding up of it that nobody has ever experienced before, right? You've got, you know, ancient Greeks complaining because they're going to lose the ability, the language will die because you're writing it and we won't be remembering things. You have the same thing that happens when paper comes in. Now you've got all these bureaucrats who emerge as a kind of profession who are tasked with having to deal with the massive volume of things that are produced. I think as humans, we do keep adapting, right? We find ways to adapt. I think the one thing, I mean, there's many things that worry me about AI as something that's being rolled out in all of its various forms, is more how it might affect our ability to use brains as a muscle. If we start to use it too much to supplement our own thinking or basic responses. But the same could be said for the internet and search and always having answers at our fingertips. If we were, God forbid, to enter into some sort of serious kind of physical conflict, all it would take is to take out the power grid, and none of this matters anymore.
Right.
And how responsive will we be? How resilient will we be if we've become so dependent on these tools to answer everything for us?
Right. And obviously, you know, one of the way we've all first started thinking about this when it comes to propaganda and things like that is people, like you said, deliberately manipulating information for their own goals. Obviously, that's a big part of it. I feel like you were trying to take a lot of that out of it to an extent and just look at it almost more dispassionately as how information gets from point A to point B and can be used. But I'm curious, kind of, as you're looking at what's happening right now, most of us just kind of, I think, process things differently. You have kind of created this framework. How are you looking at some of the recent efforts when it comes to propaganda, in order to really affect change?
Well, I mean, there's always been lots of research, and that's where I started looking at campaigns. And it's nice and it's satisfying and it's tidy, but it doesn't necessarily explain what's happening to the people who might be consuming it. And I think we leap to an assumption that because the propaganda exists and what the propagandists might have wanted happen, that's causation. And it's not enough to prove causation in a complex system. And so what I've really been more interested in now is, like, are there types of ecosystems that repeat over time? And are there certain conditions within them that repeat over time that may be indicators that you're going to have a problem? Right. And so I think it's quite clear that if you introduce a new technology that changes how information is processed and distributed, it'll increase the speed, it'll increase the volume of outputs. There tends to be more people who can participate in it. So whether it's that they got the franchise to vote, or they are now literate, or they have social media to participate in that, you're going to have new ideas come out. And those ideas will probably challenge existing ones. And that is, like, precursor to having an issue. Now, if you've got other fundamental problems like changing in economic status, changing in demographics, changing in certain skill levels that might be dipping, or perhaps other living condition issues, whether it's like a change in social services or like climate change, you may be having a more intense moment in time that makes your society far more susceptible to a problem like disinformation. So it's not the disinformation itself. That's more like a symptom. You have underlying conditions that are going to make this bad.
One of the things that you mentioned, I mean, there's been certain, as we've tackled this in recent years, people have become a lot more aware of exactly the problem that you're describing. What makes certain societies more susceptible to disinformation, or I guess propaganda campaigns, or what makes them more resilient? One of the examples that often gets highlighted as this shining example is, there's been a couple, but one of the ones that is in your book is Finland, right? For a while, it was, I think we're all looking for quick fixes all the time. It's, people just want to be able to say, oh, we've solved this. If you just do this with education, if you do this with barriers on social media, we will fix the problem of, the disinformation problem. Obviously, I'm curious kind of how you write about this, but how you approached Finland as this, as something that many people kind of pointed to as an example of resilience, and obviously that is not the quick fix everyone thinks it is.
I mean, I love Finland, so don't get me wrong, I wish they had all the answers, but it's true. Every conference, somebody says media literacy is the answer because Finland is doing well and they've got media literacy. But if you look at them like a system, they're very, very unique, very different from the US and Canada. They're a small country, like few million. They're 86 or something percent homogenous ethnic Finns, sharing the same religion. Their language is not really mutually intelligible with any others. A little bit of Estonian can understand it, but it's not like they can really be understood by their neighbors as much.
Right.
They outstrip us on so many levels, like income equality, gender equality, level of education, quality of education, trust in media. Their media isn't as polarized. And they have an existential threat on their doorstep that they have been concerned about for a long time, and it is very apparent in society.
Right.
And the winter war is not going to come up if you go to Finland.
Right. And someone that's a master of this, of information manipulation.
Actually, in their military museum, they're the first one I ever saw that seems to have a permanent exhibit for the people who worked on information, like operations, essentially, within the military in those wars. So they're just really, really unique.
Yeah.
And there's not a huge country geographically, so like their infrastructure may not need as much to be maintained as ours. And so I think, like, if you were to even apply the lessons that you think you're learning to another environment like Canada, which is like way more diverse, huge geographically. I know we're not the biggest country, but we're, several times larger than Finland, and lots of different languages, lots of different ecosystems.
Yeah. I mean, here in Washington, at least, when you speak to, you speak to lawmakers, you speak to officials who work in different agencies that try to tackle this, and the prevailing narrative is that the pandemic caused this kind of break, that the pandemic, both because of, obviously just the physical isolation and things that happen, but really just because, with the vaccine skepticism, just the whole disagreement about COVID as a whole just created this thing where these bubbles just kept drifting further and further apart, and now, really enabled these two kind of, the two different tracks that we're seeing. I'm curious, you kind of, again, seem to be giving us an actual framework to understand it, but what are the reasons that you think are, I wouldn't say for hope, but what do you look at as positive, as things that have worked, or ways that we can, kind of maybe not have this fatalistic, again, the prevailing narrative is we are just going like this and AI is speeding it up and we're never going to converge again in where we can speak in a common language.
Right. We could continue to freak out like that, and we will again when the next technology comes. That seems to me a constant. So I guess there's partly for me, if we can see patterns like that, then we could maybe stop the panic. And then maybe we can understand that there will be new technology come down the road. So maybe we don't need to know specifically what it is, but we can have a better idea about how our reactions have been so far, so we can prep for that at least. And then maybe, there's questions that we have about the rollout of technology that fundamentally changes how information is processed. Like maybe it's not a general distribution into the wilds of the internet. Maybe there's a little bit more controlled testing to understand how that's going to work. But I do think fundamentally, if we get a grip on what the information environment is, how information ecosystems work within it, we'd be in a much better footing to be able to predict or, prepare ourselves for coping with that.
Right, and speaking obviously with lots of people for this book, do you see any signs, or do you believe that governments, tech companies, others are likely to start thinking more along these lines when it comes to information and the information environment, or?
I don't see tech companies doing it. From my limited experience with tech companies, they tend to be most concerned about their own platforms or applications of whatever they're offering. So it's not really a bigger systemic view. I do see a shift in governments thinking about it, in particular democracies that are concerned about foreign interference, especially in the context of being overly dependent on particular providers who may not be within their country.
Yeah. I can see that. Let me see. I know we have some audience questions. I was told that people will submit them this way, but let's see. Just in general, again, just one more thing, because I do think that the way that this book was set up was really interesting, and it takes you back to a time, again, where we think that information, in the way that we traditionally think of it, is almost like a modern concept of it. What do you think is, I guess I want you to make the case for why people should read the book and kind of use it as a tool to shape their understanding, to really understand, again, like this, a categorization of information the same way that we look at ecology or the natural world.
Right. Obviously, I'm biased in favor of researchers reading it, because I would like them to consider how we might go in a shared direction to a bigger understanding. But I do think for the average person right now, and in a country like the US, it's clear that society is in the grips of a major information competition, and maybe having a better understanding for how different actors are going to go about trying to win your heart and mind might make you feel a little less jumpy or pushed or pulled to just be able to take the time to breathe and make decisions for yourself.
Yeah. I'm going to add, I think there's some microphones around the room if you want to grab one for your question, but I'm going to read some of the ones that were submitted at the Q&A. One of them says, disinformation isn't just video, voice, and text. Graphics can distort perception too. For instance, last night the TV networks showed state maps with each county colored blue or red. As a result, states like Virginia look largely red, even though most of the voters live in densely populated blue cities. How can we demand better, less deceptive graphics?
I'm not sure I'm best qualified to answer that one. It's a very specific tactic or question about media.
Yeah. I'm going to go to the next one then. So somebody says, I'm wondering about the concept of information ecology. How does this concept depart from the communication studies of Marshall McLuhan or the political sociology of Robert Putnam?
I think information ecology is really, and again, lots of people have been using this term. I think there's a lack of consistency in it, but it's really about creating a scientific field that can bridge many different fields. So communications theory is one of many that fits into a wider whole.
Mm-hmm. Anybody have any questions? If not, I can keep asking from my reading of the book, but yeah.
Hi, I'm Angie Holan with the International Fact-Checking Network. We represent journalism organizations that do fact-checking. There's a lot of talk within our community and the journalism community more broadly that the business models for truth-seeking journalism are being disrupted so profoundly that there may not be a business model for high-quality journalism in the future, especially considering tech platforms disrupting advertising and then AI companies disrupting search. I was wondering if you had any thoughts on that or generally the dynamics of how accuracy plays out in information ecosystems. Thanks.
I mean, I agree with you. I think that we've often talked about a business model problem when it comes to social media platforms for a long time, but there's many ways in which a business model can be problematic. I am also concerned in terms of media being very much also in a private hands a lot of the time, because there does seem to be both an interest to try to get attention, which has led many really good newspapers to participate in the same kind of clickbaity headline pursuit as everybody else. And also in some ways, some of the big newspapers have taken to things like behavioral advertising in a way to try to match emotions with what gets sold to people. And I think there's lots of questionable issues around that. And then to me, the question becomes what do we need to function as a democracy? And do we necessarily need to leave that up to a market to decide? Maybe we can't, and maybe we have to have other models. I mean, in Canada, we still have a public broadcaster, but that has become a point of contention politically. We have political actors who are attacking it. That does seem to be a key in Finland, that they do have a strong public broadcaster that is trusted. So I do think this is why we have to look at all of these kinds of things together, not just like a single issue, and how they work together and what we want for a society to function.
Thank you. Oh, is this on? Alina Traeger, the RAND Corporation. So at the risk of completely ignoring the gist of your book, which is this is a complex subject and we should slow down, not come to hasty conclusions, I want to ask you to speculate about a hasty conclusion, which is if you had to advise the U.S. government right now with the with the fact that we've sort of chopped off some of our instruments of soft power abroad, what might be the one thing you emphasize in terms of us waging information competition or information warfare, right? Again, I acknowledge you sort of reject the concepts, but we do have to speak to the world, so what would be the one thing you would emphasize?
I mean, I guess the question here is, what's the aim? Is there a strategy behind communicating to the world? I think it's really difficult to just rely on communications alone. There is a lived experience that has to match whatever is being communicated, and I think this is often forgotten, often by government communicators in particular. So I don't have a specific answer for you, other than to say that it's not just about communications. It's going to have to match with deeds, and this is one of the problems of cutting back foreign aid, if indeed the aim is to encourage countries abroad to feel positively about a particular country.
Excuse my voice is a little gravelly. My guess is in several of these talks, the tones of the questions have been very negative. So I'm going to pose a hypothetical to you to try and draw out some of the positives. Suppose that your book is the catalyst to create this field, and it's wildly successful. It's highly adopted in the academy. Infrastructure is laid so that researchers can understand and map out information ecosystems. 20 years from now, with that in place, what does that allow society to do? What are the positive things that unlocks?
I mean, in a perfect world, we'll have figured out how democracy can be adapted such that it's still functioning and actually can meet the needs of people in answering complex problems. We've unlocked whatever factors actually help us get there. And I want to be clear here, because it's not about everybody having the same perspective. That's not actually how you strive and succeed in society. But I think we need to figure out what kind of ecosystem enables us to have different viewpoints but still come to constructive decisions that are in the long-term interest of society and the planet.
Hi, David Breniatowski from George Washington University. So one of the things that I appreciate about your book and the way that you frame things, you talk about things as an ecosystem. And I think that stands in contrast to a lot of the narrative that we hear where, well, it's all from social media platforms or it's all from AI or it's changes in technology. So my question is, to what extent is the information environment a natural development versus a designed development, and how do we thread that needle?
Right, so I think the information environment in general is more of a natural phenomenon. So that's like the space where information can exist. That is the potential, like whatever gives the potential for it. And the most basic element of that is that humans, that we are able to communicate in a way that is mutually intelligible. And then that's where ecosystems form. They form from us using different means and tools like language and whatever else to produce outputs, to create a shared understanding. And it's really about the relationships between them, the dynamics between those three things, which is, again, one of the things that I think makes this a little bit more complex than just comms theory, because it's not just about communicating a message or the specific tools, it's also about the people and the processes between them. That would be my answer.
Hi, Jacob Harold with the Bergengruen Institute. A question about the governance of information infrastructure. Obviously the tech platforms are for profits, but there are lots of relevant nonprofits, Wikipedia, Mozilla, Internet Archive, and then clearly many government entities that in one way or another are housing or enabling the flow of information. So any thoughts on where in society should this infrastructure sit? And then how do we best govern it?
That's a large and sprawling question, mostly because there's like so many layers, right? Like we could be talking about the actual infrastructure, like ICT infrastructure, services that have always mostly been private sector, but then also now we're dependent on cloud and then the digital layer that comes on top of it, and then all the media and stuff. I mean, I think it's really hard to say off the top of where and how that should be. I think ideally it's probably a mix. I think with the recent cloud outages that we've faced, it's really clear too that maybe we don't want a handful of providers doing all of this because it's not the most resilient. It doesn't have the redundancy that we may need given our dependency on information communication technology for all functions of our society. So I think that, again, looking at it as a system may help us be able to determine what's needed where and who should have that and maybe what the backup plans are if that fails. I think, again, we do tend to look at these things only when something goes wrong and then we're focused in on that one thing that we never kind of get that bigger picture view.
I know there's more questions, but I'm going to just go to this because obviously I have a national security background and that's what I report on. But I think sometimes a lot of this sounds a little theoretical or dry, but really it's impacting everyday lives. It's life or death in many situations. It impacts things like national security, war, all those different things. One of the questions here was, asking how the risks associated with information evolve as populations around the world become increasingly connected to the internet, particularly in some unstable regions, or, they've mentioned West Africa, South Asia. But is there an increased risk for people with little media literacy? Yeah.
I don't know off the top of my head. I think the jury's kind of out on that. Media literacy is a very specific kind of question here. Yeah. And there's very different programs of how that gets delivered. And that isn't to say that even a person like, let's step to literacy, who has low literacy is suddenly more vulnerable to disinformation. I think that there are different things that may be contributing. Like, do they have a good social network? What are the cultural norms around different belief things? Can they ask somebody else? Is that information directly relevant to the decision that they have to make? I think there's lots of different factors that are going to go into determining whether a person is at risk or more at risk.
Right.
It's really, these are going to be really unsatisfying answers.
Right. Right. No, it's true. And like you said, a lot of this is still happening as we discuss. And yeah. I think sometimes, this is a micro level because this person was particularly asking about people on their own. But obviously, I feel like this is, currently a field that is really rapidly evolving is, again, as we've mentioned, like societies as a whole, how vulnerable are they? What are the risks associated with that resilience?
Right.
But it's changing by the day, right?
Right. I mean, and I don't think we really have a good beat on what resilience looks like. We're using these words, but how do you know what is resilient in a system if we don't even know what the system is, right? We're only looking at pieces. I would say anecdotally, you look at a country like Kenya that was overly exposed to a lot of disinformation, and many civil society actors on the ground have said that people, especially young people there, are very resilient to disinformation. They don't believe it. Right. And so I think sometimes maybe there's also an assumption that some countries may be more susceptible given where they may be placed on this whole global development scale of things, and I think that might not be true.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I'm Mike Nelson. I work on technology issues and innovation here at Carnegie, and I want to build on the optimistic question that Arthur asked. I've been in this area for a long time, and I've been a technological optimist the entire time, except in this area. I don't see the magic technology that could help us. People are claiming that if we just get rid of anonymity, or if we have some magic digital ID, or we have some super artificial intelligence that will help Facebook clean up the internet, that all will be good. So my question is, are you as skeptical as me, or have you heard somebody make an argument that there is some technology that in 5 years or 10 years could make the ecosystem so much better and so much less polluted?
I mean, to borrow from another Canadian, Paris Marx, tech won't save us, right? And I think that this is something that I think it's a mistake we keep making. Like, we see that we're quick to say that technology is making things worse, but then why do we assume that it's also going to make it better? I think the likely keys are going to be in reconnecting society in more traditional ways. I've got this nagging thing in my head recently about all the ways in which things like social media have been described, using words like engagement and community. And I think that there's been a misconception that it would somehow replace those concepts that always existed in the real world. And really, those tools were more something that could be additive, not replacing. And I think we're coming to find out that that is the case, right? This is what we're learning after the pandemic. So, I mean, I'm hopeful because I think that if we look for maybe non-tech solutions, like how do we reimagine libraries that can bring generations back together in ways? How do we create community programs to respond to immediate needs, to build bridges and social cohesion? How do we reimagine democracy in a way that actually engages more people than a vote every couple years? So I think it's going to have to be a combination of things. That doesn't mean we can't use technology, but we really shouldn't hope that it's going to help fix humans.
I have a somewhat self-interested question as a member of the press, but often maligned fairly as a really big part of the problem, but potentially part of I'm not going to say solution, but we can all do better as journalists in order to do our best to inform readers in the best ways possible and not spread these narratives and be skeptical and again, like, constantly adapt our own understanding of the information environment. This is kind of all throughout your book because obviously, the press is always, media has always, it's often a bigger part of how people process information, and now obviously with social media and everything, it's become this other thing. But I'm kind of curious, I guess, as you're looking at how the media and I guess large journalism outlets, I will say as a whole, are handling this rapidly evolving information environment. I guess what you would think of as things that I guess advice or things that you hope to see in my industry. I won't be offended.
It's like, I really wish I had all of these answers. Then with Carnegie, we'd have a program for life. I think lots of different things on this. Like, media obviously has played a really important role, and journalists have always, like, at least since the English Civil War, there has been this concept of like a news paper idea almost, and people documenting what's happening. I have been working on and off with media organizations for quite a long time, actually. I used to do training with media, and also just trying to understand how things were changing. And I think media organizations are often, at least in the North American context, but probably beyond that, swept up in this like changing nature of how to produce. And even the great BBC will have clickbait news articles. Like the titles will be that way. And I think that it's kind of inescapable, but at the same time, it's part of the problem. And I kind of wonder if there is a realm in which we don't all have to race to the bottom. Like, would there possibly be a market? Nobody wants to try it, obviously, because everybody's too afraid to fail. But is there a slow news? Is there an equivalent of that? I don't know. I think that there's a bit of an experimentation that has to happen, but unless we kind of snap out of specific paradigms like, I have to have the biggest audience and I have to break all of the stuff like the fastest, I don't think that that's a game that anybody's going to win. It wasn't again, not a satisfying answer.
I mean, I don't think we expect satisfying answers, but I think it's very useful because you, as someone who's most of us haven't spent this much time thinking about this in a holistic way, and so someone who has, I think we all appreciate using it as a sounding board to figure out how you look at some of these things from the bird's eye view. Any other questions?
I think it strikes me because we're all actors in it in some way or another, and we all may have different roles, right? Like we are all consumers in a way, and we're all asked to participate in this great democratic experiment. But then you, as a journalist, have a different role that is to like convey information to other people, and you're dependent on certain platforms in order to be able to do that. And I think in some ways I would just encourage everybody, and I'm not trying to preach because I have my own weaknesses as a human, but just to like calm down, step back before reacting to whatever is in front of us. We don't have to react right away, even if you're breaking news.
Fair. There's actually another question here, which I think we got at a little bit, but it's pretty interesting. But what do you think an ideal tech-government relation looks like, considering the power that tech holds? At some point, it's basically small countries on their own. They're often more powerful than any government entities or any regulation. As you've been researching this book, how do you think about this?
I don't know. I'm growing more and more pessimistic by the day about it. Sorry to my tech friends. I'm less and less. I never really believed that technology companies could just govern themselves in the interest of society, and that would be great. That was, I don't think, ever going to be the case. But I do think that when governments go to regulate, they maybe should think through it in certain steps. Like right now. And again, I feel like this is a conversation that really was like 10 years ago. We don't really understand much about those platforms or how they're affecting things. So like the first step was like, do we need to release this into the wild? Should that have happened? Could we have, some sort of scale that it's almost like drug testing? Like, let's just get a handle on what this is going to mean and how it's going to work. Ideally with an understanding of how the wider information environment works. But then transparency reporting that actually really gets at what these companies are doing and how that works and how that fits into the bigger picture. I mean, the DSA is now out, but it's still a big experiment to see whether that works or not. And I feel like jumping to things like my own country with online harms bills, maybe like a step too far in terms of like also thinking through how do you measure what that harm is to make it law. Like some things are really obvious, like financial crime is really cut and clear. I think abuse of children, again, I think almost everybody should be agreeing that this is wrong and you can have rules around that. But if you start to slide into something around more generic content moderation, I think you're really getting you're putting the horse before the cart.
Right. For sure. And I think that, it's kind of, I think we've all experienced this because as we look backwards, obviously hindsight is 2020, but now you look at, the 2016 disinformation campaigns, you look at even things like, we've seen the tightening and the loosening of a lot of the guardrails. Elon Musk's takeover of Twitter, it looks very different than it did,
Right.
I guess X, very different than it did a little while ago. And, we in hindsight, we can see how, of course, Facebook was going to become a mass spread of disinformation, or of course, this was going to have an impact at a mass global scale. But in the moment, you never do. So I'm curious whether you think that, or hope, I guess, that more people adopting the kind of systemized view of information that you lay out in your book, not exactly that one, but thinking about it the way you do, will hopefully avoid that cycle that we've been living in.
Well, I think what the book will tell you is that every tool that will be produced will be used at some point by someone to try to manipulate people, whether it's to gain a profit or have them believe something. And so it will inevitably be used for disinformation. I think that's just we have to accept that will always be the case no matter what the technology is. There was something I wanted to say about the governance question before, and that is that, this dynamic between just government and industry, the problem is policymakers don't really have a whole lot of time to think or figure out things, so they're looking to researchers to tell them the answer and be pressed. But a big challenge of this is that the researchers aren't well funded, right? So if it's civil society, it's project to project, and if it's academic, they're gonna do it on the side of their regular job, so everybody's chasing money, and it is really precarious of how to have the resources to do it, where that money comes from, and the independence to be able to inform that kind of work.
Yeah. It might be helpful for people here, since we're all interested, present company excluded. Who do you think is looking at this well in terms of, it could be specific organizations or specific, obviously it's changing by the day, but I'm curious whose work you look at and think, okay, they're really kind of pushing the envelope there in terms of not staying behind.
I think about a lot of the researcher work that went into informing the DSA, and scholars like Rebecca Tromble and others who really devoted a lot of their, I would say almost their own time. It wasn't all funded to be able to inform how that particular piece around researcher data access is going to be informed. I just think that we need more of that, and they need to have more stability in being able to pursue those things, because working between stakeholders is so time-consuming and difficult.
Yeah. I know we're going close on time, but I'm curious if you could tell us, how you came upon the title of your book, the Information Animal, and then just to wrap it up. I guess hopefully you all read it, but what you really hope the takeaway will be for most people who I know it's almost meant, it's not difficult book. It doesn't have a clear, it's not, as you said, it's not supposed to be neat. It's not supposed to have solutions, and it's not meant to have a satisfying answer, but really it's supposed to give us the tool to think about the information environment in a more systemic way. So I'm curious, if you had to sum it up, what you hope people take away from it?
That there is an information environment, and that it is possible for us to get a grasp of what it means and how we shape it and it shapes us. And you asked about the title.
About the title.
Yeah, well, because we are information animals. It's encoded in us. It's in our DNA. It is basically all of our response is wrapped up in information one way or another, but our understanding of information is often really weak and focused on something like a newspaper, and it's so much more than that.
Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. Okay, did we just escape?
And I got my next.